So at this point, I'm going to go over how to create some shapes from scratch using a combination of selection tools that we've already used or already gone over, as well as the paintbrush tool. And I'm going to be going over layers and use of them extensively in order to kind of outline and give you a preview of how I'd like you to perform the first assignment, because this first assignment is limiting the number of tools that you can use in order to ensure that you can grasp how they function as easy as possible. So you're going to be using a combination of the move tool, any of the selection tools, so that's the marquee, the lasso, and the magic wand series, and the paintbrush tool. This is going to be done in black and white in shades of gray. We're going to be organizing the layers in such a way that we can easily visually break down and understand how the parts come apart and are put together. Alright, so the first assignment pertains to dealing with rendering three-dimensional shapes. So I've taken the liberty of just looking up simple 3D geometric shapes in Google, and some are simple, some are more complex than others, but these are all perfectly good examples of what I mean by three-dimensional shapes. So a sphere is going to be the simplest, a cube would probably be the next, and when you get into different shapes it can be a little bit trickier, but these are generally what I'm looking for. And if you want to take it more complex, that's okay. I'm alright with that. If you want to build an entire scene out of shapes, your end result's going to kind of look sort of like some of these. And I will share some former successful student examples with you also to ensure that you understand, what capabilities, what options you have of getting a realistic end result. But the things I want you to look at, especially with some of these three-dimensional shapes, is that those are really reflective. We'll use this one as an example. There's a pretty defined light source. It looks like the light is coming from kind of behind you. So like if you were the camera, it'd be kind of to the left side. And I can see that based on reflections. You can see that each side has its own shapes, or shades, has its own shades. And there's a shadow beneath each of the shapes. It may be subtle, it may be dark. And there's interaction between each of these shapes. Some of them are stacked on top of one another. This cone is casting a shadow onto this prism shape. So these are things that you are going to be doing by scratch using the tools that I'm going to cover with you today. So I'm going to start with a sphere. I'm going to create a layer for the sphere itself. And I'm also going to create a layer for its shadow. Okay, and knowing that the shadow is always going to be beneath whatever's casting it, assuming that the light source is coming from above, I'm just going to rearrange those layers. So I'm going to select the sphere layer. I'm going to pick my elliptical marquee tool, and I'm just going to, it doesn't have to be perfectly circle, I'm just going to grab a shape. I'm going to get my paintbrush tool, and clearly this is a little small for the way I'm going to be using it, so I'll increase the size of my brush, and I'll use my brackets for this just because it's easier. And I'm going to paint. Now this is very dramatic lighting. You can see that my paintbrush is almost too big for the way that I need it. But this is super dramatic lighting. It gets the point across, but if I have a shadow, it's all going to kind of blend in and merge into one great big mess. So I need to gradually build up the light and shadow here. Right now my opacity is set to 100% and my foreground color is set to black. That means that it's going to give me black almost immediately like it did here. I only had to use the brush once. So I'm going to reduce my opacity to 10%. And this may not seem like a lot, but this is going to allow for me to gradually build up realistic tones without going too dark. And you'll notice my brush is almost the size of the sphere. That's okay. In this case, because I'm not dealing with details, but I'm dealing with generalized shades, a larger brush is totally fine. So I'm going to very gradually build up, and I'm going to click a fair amount. You'll notice that my history will start to show. And if 10% is going too slow, you could raise it to 20% if you wanted to. But I wouldn't go any higher than that. So it's starting to look very nice and round and three-dimensional. If you wanted to maybe lighten it, maybe this has gone a little too dark, you can reverse the foreground and background color, and rather than erase what you've already done, you can paint white in where you'd like it to be. Okay? The hotkey to reverse the foreground and background color is the X key. So switch foreground and background colors, you can see it says it right there. So I'm hitting the X key and it's bouncing between the two. So I'm going to Control or Command D to deselect. I'm pretty happy with the way that this sphere looks. Not too bad. But I think that I could, it needs a shadow. The ball itself looks three-dimensional, but it's floating in space. It isn't doing anything really incredible here. I need it to kind of give it a shadow so that it feels like it's sitting on a surface, a real surface. So now I'm going to switch to the shadow layer. I'm going to grab my elliptical marquee tool again, and I'm going to drag a selection out. I'll zoom in here. Drag a selection out. This is going to represent the shadow. Oops. Undo. The shadow of my sphere. I'm going to grab the paintbrush tool again. Make sure that black is my foreground color, and I'm going to treat it the same way. And then I might go back in, hit X to reverse the two. Shrink, and I'm just going to lighten the edges and darken the middle of my shadow. So I'm just taking some artistic license here to sort of make it blend like you would expect it to if it were a real shadow. So now I'm going to hit Control D to deselect. So my shadow looks good and my sphere looks good. But the area that combines the two, that little wedge, that little sliver where the two layers overlap, doesn't look great. There shouldn't be space there. In order for this sphere to look whole and not transparent, we need to remove that extra little bit of stuff. So there are a couple different ways to do it. I'm going to show you how I don't want you to do it first. What I don't want you to do is to get the eraser tool and try to cut it out, because no matter how careful you are, you see how I'm trying to get up against the edge and I'm just shaving too much off. I don't want that to happen. We're going to be a lot more exact. So I'm going to undo what I did. And we're going to use the selection tools again to help solve this problem. So if you recall, when we were dealing with some of the selection tools, you have the ability to add or remove from a selection that's already made. We're going to use a combination of these functions in order to just isolate a selection around that area. So I'm going to go to my magic wand tool, and I'm going to click on my sphere, and I'm going to select my sphere. Now, you can see, if you recall, magic wand doesn't always follow directions, doesn't always, select everything that you want, but it's selected all of this area, and that's good. So I'm going to leave it where it is. All right, so that was on the sphere layer. Now I'm going to click on the shadow. So on this shadow layer, only this portion applies to the selection. So if I wanted to, I could just hit the backspace or the delete key, and you'll notice that everything that was inside of that selection on the sphere shadow layer has been deleted. And now I've got a very clean, crisp edge that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. If I wanted to make it even more crisp, you can see there's just tiny little bits here and there. If I wanted to make it even more crisp, I could move to my move tool and just move that layer up just a touch so it removes that white space. Nice and clean. If I decided maybe I'd like to go a little bit darker on that shadow, I could switch to my magic wand tool, click, and then I'm holding down the shift key to add to the selection, to reselect the shadow that I've created, and then I could switch over to my brush and add to the current selection if I'd like to. And I know I'm probably making it look easy. That's my job. I'm, teaching the class for a reason. Don't stress, just practice. Once you get the hang of the selection tools, it'll be a lot easier to do these sorts of functions. Selection tools and the brush tool. Most of the other tools are based off of these. So if you can master those, you'll be in good shape. So that's my sphere and its accompanying shadow. To group them together the way that I've asked everybody to do for the assignment, you're going to create what's called a group. It looks like a folder, like a little tabbed folder. I'm going to click on it. By default it says group 1. I'll call it sphere group. And then I'm going to click and shift click on the layers that are going to go inside of that group, and I'm going to drag them into the group. And you'll see that they indent. That means that they have been included in the group. So I can minimize and maximize that group. I can hide everything in the group or display everything in the group. That group is now editable as a single unit rather than two separate layers. So this is great for when you need to organize your layers within Photoshop. This makes it much easier for you to keep track of all your parts rather than potentially not naming your layers and having it be, layer 37 copy and not know exactly what that means and what it's for. So staying organized, that's another big part of this assignment, is staying organized. So name everything in your layers panel and group like items together. So now I'm going to do something a little more complex. I'm going to make a cube. I jump back over here. A cube is like a box, like this guy right here. If you think of when you were a kid, maybe taking geometry, drawing kind of like an ice cube sort of shape, that's the direction that I'm going in here. So I'm going to create a new layer. call it my cube. I'm going to move my sphere down a little bit. So the idea that I have for my cube, I'm just going to draw it out really fast just to sort of illustrate the point. So I'd like to do something sort of like this. And then if I'm going to have the lighting match my sphere, I think the shadow would be somewhere over like that, give or take. Now, this is where it can get a little bit tricky because I'm dealing with more than just 2 layers. I'm dealing with 1, 2, 3, 4 layers. And not only that, but in order for it to be convincing geometrically, I need to make sure that my edges are straight and my angles match. So this is where guides come into play. In order to use guides, you have to have your rulers displayed. Okay? So to kind of give myself sort of a cheat sheet, in a sense, I'm going to draw out guides. So I'm going to click inside of my ruler and drag. And then I'll do the top one as well. If you decide you'd like to move your guides, you need to get the move tool. You don't need the move tool to create them, but if you want to move them, you'll need to grab that. Also, if you're using the increments on the rulers and you want, say, a cube that's exactly 2 inches by 2 inches, hold down the Shift key and it will snap to all of the units on the ruler, all those little dashes. Alright, so, alright, I've got the face of my cube right now. So I'm going to grab my rectangular marquee tool. I'm going to place it at the corner of the guides. And that allows for me to create an exact shape. Cool. So I'll go ahead and color that in. Go back down to 20% opacity. Raise the size of my brush. Color it in. Knowing that one side of my box is going to be darker than the other because of the way that I'm going to create it, I'm going to go ahead and not give this side a heck of a lot of shading. That's just a choice. So now what I'm going to do is I need to draw out more guides in order to create the sides of my cube. So we've already dealt with the front surface, but I need to create these side surfaces. I'm going to pick a measurement that works for what I want. But I need to do it on each edge so I know where all the corners are going to go also. So I'm kind of making a second square like the first one that I made. But just offset a little bit. Next, I'm going to grab my polygonal lasso tool and I'm going to create a new layer, and this will be the side of my cube. Cube side. I'm going to hit Control or Command D to deselect. I'm going to click the corner of my cube and trace where the side is going to be located. And color him in. And then I'll do the same thing for the top. New layer, cube top, deselect, grab my magnetic lasso, Use the corners to assess where the top's going to be, and then color it in. Easy peasy. So now all of my cube pieces are separate. This helps me grade you. It also helps you stay organized. So I should be able to take and pull all your pieces apart and fit them back together like a puzzle. That's how these shapes need to be put together. I'm going to make a new group. I'm going to call it my cube. Group. Click and shift click to highlight all my cube parts, and I'm going to drag them in. So now if I need to move the cube, rather than moving each piece separately, I can just select the group and move it as a single unit. So if I wanted this cube to sit on top of the sphere, you can see I'm getting the same sort of problem. Oh, thought of another tool that I can show you. It's not a tool so much as it's an option. If I wanted to tilt this cube so it looks like it's standing on a corner, I can do that using the free transform option. You can get to it by going to Edit and selecting Free Transform. You can also use Control-T on a PC or Command-T on a Mac and to select it, and it makes this little box around that shape. And I can tilt that shape so that it sits on its side. Other things that you can do with free transform are squish and stretch. I'd be really careful about doing that though, because you are squishing and stretching pixels, and even though our document is at 300 dpi, you will want to make sure that you are not accidentally causing harm to the document that you're producing. So please be careful. I would not squish and stretch if you can help it at all for this assignment. It will come into play later. But free transform is great if you need to tilt something or rotate something. So I'll hit return to set it. You'll notice that all of the layers updated. So we'll say I want my cube to stand like this on the tip of the sphere. I would do the same process to remove the overlap as I did with the shadow. I'll start by selecting the sphere, then I'll select the cube layer that shares that space, I will deselect the portion that they share. So I can either come up here and click subtract from selection, or I'm holding down the Alt key. This isolates, and then I remove it from the layer that's on the bottom. I'm just hitting delete to do that, to remove or clear what's in that layer. You could also, if it's selected, you could also use the erase tool if you wanted to. You know, it's just a personal preference. The delete key is just, you know, a few less steps. So now I need to add a shadow to my cube. Cube shadow. I'm going to, just to make sure that my shadow stays in the same place, because if I just randomly start shading, all of a sudden I'm getting like a cloud that covers the whole thing. That isn't at all what I want. So I want to, again, use a selection to make sure that the shapes that I'm making are as clear as possible. So now I've got a shadow inside of the sphere, on the surface of the sphere, but not looking as though it's artificial. It looks like the cube is casting a shadow on the sphere. Now, here's a mistake that I actually made, and it's important that you don't do the same thing. You see how my cube shadow isn't disappearing, but when I turn my sphere off, it does? I was on the wrong layer as I was painting in the cube shadow. This is why paying attention to your history is really important. You need to make sure that you stay on the proper layers for the things that you're going to be editing. Staying organized and being able to back up and correct problem areas, there we go, is a big part of this assignment and all of the Photoshop assignments. So I've got my cube, I've got my sphere. I'm going to add one more kind of complex shape to this document. So I want to do something that combines straight edges and curved edges. And I downloaded a file, or a photograph really, of a funnel that is cylindrical but then has a spout coming out of the end. That would be very difficult to produce using some of these tools without maybe an idea of what direction to go to. So I'm going to go to File and Place, and I'm going to find the photo that I saved. There it is. And it's going to, oops, looks like it's putting it in the middle of my cube group. That's okay. I'm just going to drag it out of there so it's on top. So I'm going to take this shape, and I'm going to use this photo that I downloaded off the internet to kind of trace the shape so I can recreate it. Okay? I'm going to do this using guides. So I'm going to hide my sphere and my cube just so that they're not in the way. If you need to remove a guide, you can just click it and drag it back to the ruler, and that will put it back where it needs to go. And I'm going to use some of these guides that are still hanging out since I'm done with my sphere to help me determine how I need to lay out guides for my cylinder that I'm going to produce. And I'm going to, everywhere that there's an edge or a top or bottom or a corner, I'm going to add a guide. And that's going to make sure that all the spots that have intersections are as accurate as possible. So I'm going to start with the biggest portion. That's going to be this cylindrical opening. Create a new layer. I'll call it funnel opening. I'll grab my elliptical marquee tool, and using this box, this large box where that open cylindrical area is, I'm going to use that to help create my borders. Okay? And then I'm going to color it in. And if you want to see, you can color it in on top of the photo. If you want to hide the photo, you can do it this way too. If you want to use the photo to kind of trace over what you've got, that's fine. If you wanted to even use some of those shiny parts inside of the funnel to kind of emulate the reflective nature of some of the portions, you could do that too. I would just shrink the size of my brush to make sure that it's as detailed as possible, if that were the direction I wanted to go in. Not too bad. So I'll hit Control D to deselect. Next layer, I'm going to call it the funnel side. And again, I'm going to use, since I'm dealing with straight edges, I'm going to use my polygonal lasso tool. I might need another guide for this. Yeah, kind of figure out where the funnel starts. There we go. So I'm going to bring it to here, go across, and I'm just dealing with it in parts. Okay, I'm going to hide my funnel shape. Ooh. As we can see, it doesn't quite line up. I might deselect, adjust where some of the shapes are, some of the guides, and give it another try. There we go, it's a little closer. Now I'm going to hide my funnel. You can clearly see that it's overlapping with parts we don't want. So again, magic wand, hold down the Alt key or click this area here to subtract from the selection. Now you can see there I had an error. No pixels were selected. This is because I'm on a layer that doesn't have anything painted on it yet. It will remove your selection. So I'll just back up in my history, switch to the funnel opening, because that'll help it see what it needs to remove. There we go. Now switch back to the funnel side and paint in whatever you need to paint in. Okay. I wanted to add the spout on, same thing. This will be a little bit easier actually, because it's a single spot. If you're concerned about making sure it matches, you could even just highlight, delete what I've got there, and then treat it all as a single unit. Either way, doesn't really matter. It all comes down to how you break it down. But each major portion needs to have its own layer. Control deselect. Now this funnel has extra parts. It's got like a little lip around the top with little handles that I didn't include. I'm just trying to simplify it. If I were grading this, I'm going to go up to View and click Rulers and Extras to hide the guides. If I were grading this, if this was something that was given to me as a student, I'd say, you know, it would be nice if the top portion of the funnel and then this bottom portion of the funnel lined up a little bit better. So you have a degree of creative license with changes that you can make. But I want it to look as realistic and three-dimensional as possible for all intents and purposes. You know, You don't have to go this detailed with something metallic. You can keep it simple with shapes such as the cube and the sphere. Okay, it doesn't have to be incredibly detailed. So I wanted to take my funnel. I'm gonna Control or Command T to pull up Free Transform. I'm gonna shrink it. Maybe tilt it like he's balancing on top of the cube. You can see it looks like, when I'm zoomed out, it kind of looks like I've got a little bit of a white gap between the two. Zoom in to double check, because sometimes it's just Photoshop simplifying things. If you still see it at 100%, or you look up here and see it's 100%, then make a change. So I could move my funnel opening. A little bit, just to correct it. But that would be fine. The funnel would just need a shadow at this point. So for the assignment, you're picking a minimum of 5 shapes. Doesn't have to be more than that, but you can do more if you'd like. I'm going to post some student examples from the past that both stick to simple shapes as well as created a complicated scene of shapes that are all good examples of what I would like to see for this assignment. Lastly, I'm going to show you how to save. For this assignment, you are going to be providing me 3 separate files. One of them is going to be a PSD file. This is a Photoshop document. This is what I'm going to open, and I'll be able to see all of your layers and turn them on and turn them off. You're going to be giving me one of these for each assignment you produce this term. So I'm going to call this, you know, if I would use the proper naming, Corrado J, last name first initial, underscore, project 1, we'll say, .psd. And I'm saving this to my desktop. So here's what it would look like. I'm also saving a JPEG. Save as, name it the same thing, select JPEG, project 1, you're going to go underscore print, because this is print resolution. Okay, now you're also giving me a web resolution JPEG. The way that you access this is you go to Image, Image Size, right down here. 300 dpi is print resolution, 72 dpi is web resolution. You can see how drastically the pixel width changes from 300 dpi to 72 dpi. Hit OK. Save as. Select JPEG again. You could even click on this one, but make sure you rename it so that it says web or web resolution or whatever. Okay. Big thing to remember. When you close out of your Photoshop document, make sure, oops, and I saved it accidentally. Let me open her back up. If you don't save your Photoshop document ahead of time, and you're waiting to do it till the end, make sure that when you save it, it's still at print resolution. If you save it at web resolution, and I'm going to show you the difference between the JPEGs in terms of quality. This one is our web res, and it's zoomed in to 100%. So if I try to zoom in closer, you see how the edges are starting to look kind of gross? Whereas I have to zoom in to 400% to see it at the same size, but the quality is significantly less versus print. You want to make sure that your Photoshop document stays at print. Even when you change it for making the JPEG, change it back before you do your final save. Because if you accidentally overwrite your PSD as a lower resolution than it's supposed to be, you are going to lose points on your assignment. Okay. So that's it in a nutshell for the first assignment. Lectures from this point on are going to move forward, but if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please touch base with me. You can do it in a discussion board. You can do it via email. If you'd like to post like a work in progress and like me to let you know what I think, I'd be more than happy to give you an in-progress critique on what I think could use work. But as far as the assignment goes, this is basically it in a nutshell. Good luck.